Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into quite a mix of subjects for you.
Yeah, a lot on the table.
We're looking at the current state of American politics, how political beliefs are shifting,
Mm-hmm.
some really interesting things happening down in Virginia,
Definitely worth watching there.
and then these sort of wider cultural and societal trends that, well, you just can't ignore them.
No, they connect to everything else.
So our source material today is drawn from a recorded discussion. It gives us a pretty raw, unfiltered look at how these pieces maybe fit together.
Right. It's less polished, more direct, perhaps.
Exactly. And our goal, like always, is to pull out the most valuable insights for you, help you grasp the bigger picture without, getting totally bogged down in all the details.
And what I find really compelling about this particular dive is the personal journey that seems to underpin a lot of the observations we'll be exploring.
Mm.
It's not just abstract political theory,
All right.
right? It's about how one person's experiences shape their view of things.
Exactly. And the individual whose insights really sparked this is Matt Waters.
Okay.
Some folks might remember his name from previous campaigns here in Virginia. He ran for Senate, House of Delegates, as a libertarian.
Right. I recall that. He's also done political consulting work.
Yeah, that's right. And more recently, he started a Substack called The New Right Report. It's been getting some attention.
Oh,
And that's actually how we came across his perspective. It really made us think about some of these issues in a new light.
that Substack, it sounds like it offers a pretty unique viewpoint then.
Yeah.
Mixing politics with maybe deeper cultural thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. It's that kind of direct, sort of unfiltered take that can sometimes cut through the noise you get from, the usual political talk.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, so let's unpack some of this. Maybe start with Matt's own path, his journey to libertarianism.
Right.
It wasn't exactly a straight line, which I think makes it more interesting, actually.
Usually isn't, is it?
No. Apparently, it started when he was younger, reading Reason magazine.
Ah, reason. Yeah, that's a classic starting point for many libertarians, isn't it?
It seems so, individual liberty, limited government, that whole message.
But what's intriguing is that his first sort of dip into politics went a very different way.
Yeah. How so?
Well, he got involved with the new Christian right.
Mm-hmm.
Figures like Richard Viguerie, Jerry Falwell.
Wow. Okay. That is a different direction.
It really highlights how complex these political journeys can be.
Yeah.
How people's views evolve with different experiences, different ideas they encounter.
Right. And that initial involvement, it didn't stick. He got disillusioned with mainstream Republican politics.
Okay.
He specifically mentioned names like Dole, McCain, Romney, felt they weren't really addressing the things he cared about.
A common sentiment for some, I suppose.
Yep.
Dissatisfaction with the establishment wing.
Yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting again. His sort of re-engagement came through Ron Paul.
Ron Paul. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense then. The consistency of his message. Limited government, fiscal conservatism, non-interventionist foreign policy.
Exactly. That name resonates with a lot of people who feel, like the main parties aren't listening.
Absolutely. If you're feeling disconnected from the Republican establishment, Paul's principled stance could be, yeah, very appealing.
And then came Trump.
Right. The big disruptor.
Matt apparently supported Trump early on, and part of his reasoning, it seems, was actually because of the strong opposition Trump got.
A reaction to the reaction, kind of.
Yeah, from both the Republican establishment and the media. He saw something in Trump, pointed to what he called his good instincts.
Hmm.
Examples, like not bombing Iran, meeting with Kim Jong-un, things where Trump went against the usual foreign policy script.
Right, challenging the status quo. For someone skeptical of how things were usually done, that could look like a positive departure.
Yeah, it definitely taps into that broader feeling, doesn't it? That deep dissatisfaction with D.C. and wanting someone to just, shake things up.
Even if you didn't agree with everything, the willingness to challenge norms was maybe the appeal for some.
He also talked about Trump's relationship with the military-industrial complex.
The Eisenhower warning. Still relevant.
Very. Matt echoed that warning about its potential for, undue influence. He brought up examples like moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem
Yep.
and the withdrawal of equipment from Afghanistan as maybe instances where Trump was pushing back against that powerful establishment.
The argument being that constant conflict benefits certain industries,
Yeah.
and Trump was questioning that.
That seems to be the idea, yeah.
Yeah.
reasserting civilian control perhaps over some of those foreign policy and military spending decisions.
It's a persistent concern, that whole military-industrial complex influence,
Mm-hmm.
decades old.
Then we get to the COVID years. This was interesting. Matt talked about his experience with clients in the anti-vax
Right.
space.
Delicate territory there.
Right. And he wasn't necessarily taking a stance himself, pro or anti, but he observed the really strong feelings around it.
Intense issue for sure.
And this led him to observe what he saw as government overreach and disinformation during the pandemic.
Such as.
He pointed to things like censorship, people getting deplatformed by PayPal, Amazon, vaccine mandates, examples of where he felt government and corporate power might be stepping over the line.
Yeah, that whole period really highlighted the tension, didn't it, between public health concerns and individual rights.
Absolutely. And the whole online information, misinformation thing created a really complex situation. The responses from government, tech companies, huge debate about where the lines are.
Still being debated, really.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit now. Let's dig into his views on the evolution of political ideology itself.
Right. How does he see himself now?
He calls himself a classical liberal and a libertarian.
Okay.
He even mentioned Hayek's essay, Why I Am Not a Conservator,
Hayek. Key figure. What was the point he drew from that?
emphasizing what he sees as the sort of progressive nature of economics, technology, entrepreneurship.
Right. Hayek's argument that conservatism is inherently reactive, trying to preserve things.
Exactly. Whereas classical liberalism, as Hayek saw it, is more forward-looking, embracing innovation, individual initiative as drivers of progress.
Yeah, not just trying to hold on to the past.
He also mentioned George Nash's book, The Conservative Movement since 1945.
A standard text on the topic.
Yeah, and he talked about the big shifts within conservatism over time, highlighted William F. Buckley's role.
Buckley, yeah. National Review, defining the boundaries, even excluding groups like the Birchers.
Right. It just shows how conservative today is, a result of history and internal debates. It wasn't always defined this way.
Buckley was definitely key in shaping that modern American conservative movement,
Yeah.
trying to fuse different strands, libertarian, traditionalist, anti-communist.
This then led to a really interesting historical side point about the American founders.
Okay.
Mostly Protestant or deist, right? And he touched on the historical concerns back then about Catholicism's connection to monarchy.
Right. The anxieties about papal authority and compatibility with Republican ideals.
Yeah, and he mentioned the Monroe Doctrine as maybe reflecting some of that sentiment in foreign policy, preventing European, often Catholic, powers from recolonizing the Americas.
That historical context definitely shaped early American attitudes and policies. Long history of Protestant-Catholic conflict in Europe played into it.
He then made an interesting contrast between the views of many sort of ordinary Catholics today and the official positions of the Catholic hierarchy on certain issues like the death penalty, Second Amendment, immigration.
Right. Underscores the diversity within any large group, religious ones included. Avoid generalizations.
Exactly. Individual Catholics hold a whole spectrum of views, don't necessarily follow the official line on everything.
No, definitely not. Important point.
And finally, on ideology, he brought up Judge Bork.
Robert Bork, slouching towards Gomorrah.
That's the one. He contrasted Bork's desire to use government to, promote a certain morality.
Right, using state power for moral ends.
With the libertarian view, the government really can't change people's hearts.
The fundamental debate. Role and limits of government in shaping values and behavior.
Exactly. Libertarians tend to be pretty skeptical about legislating morality, right? Seeing it as coercion, suppressing freedom.
That tension is always there in political thought.
Okay, let's shift gears again, talk about his reflections on the Trump era and also the more recent RFK Jr. campaign.
Right.
Matt apparently believes Trump's actions, quote, blew the government up.
Blew the government up. Strong words, meaning disruptive. Challenging norms.
Yeah, I think that's the sense. A significant break from traditional politics, traditional governance.
A view shared by supporters and opponents alike, in a way.
Yeah.
That it was a major disruption. Whether good or bad depends on your perspective, obviously.
He then talked about attending the March on Washington for medical freedom.
Okay. What struck him about that?
The sheer diversity of the crowd. He mentioned RFK Jr. being there, followers of Louis Farrakhan,
Oh, wow.
Orthodox Jews, evangelicals, atheists, all united, he said, by concern over government overreach in health matters.
That is a striking coalition. Shows how specific issues can cut across the usual political and social lines sometimes.
Really unexpected alliances can form when people feel strongly about one particular thing, like vaccine mandates or government control over healthcare.
Yeah, it can bring together groups with very different priorities otherwise.
And this experience, it seems, partly led to him getting involved in the RFK Jr. presidential campaign.
Okay, that connects.
He emphasized the motivation being, supporting someone challenging established agencies, the FDA, CDC, etc., and what he called their lies and propaganda.
Right. RFK Jr.'s message of skepticism towards those institutions definitely resonated with some voters, including conservatives and libertarians who felt distrustful.
He even mentioned a specific website critical of the FDA, so really focused on that anti-agency sentiment.
It tapped into a vein of distrust, for sure.
He also talked about optimism regarding potential pardons from Trump if he
Yep.
were to return, mentioned Snowden, Ross Ulbricht, and the possibility of declassifying government files. Things related to MLK, JFK, RFK, even UFOs.
Ah, the secret files. Always a topic of interest.
His idea was that declassification could reveal uncomfortable truths, maybe further erode trust in institutions like the CIA, FBI.
It's always a complex debate.
Yes.
Declassification, transparency versus national security concerns,
Yeah.
potential for misinterpretation, contentious stuff.
Definitely. Okay, let's bring it back home now. Virginia politics.
All right. What were his thoughts there?
Well, he expressed some skepticism about Winsome Sears' chances in the 2025 election.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Several reasons he gave. He perceived her as having an anti-Trump stance, mentioned a Mar-a-Lago cancellation, lack of Trump mentions at rallies, also felt she hadn't had significant legislative wins, and he viewed her as sometimes playing the race card.
It's a pretty critical take, especially from someone who supported her before, right?
Yeah, it is. It suggests her path to building a broad coalition for a statewide run might face some hurdles based on these perceptions anyway.
Her political trajectory since becoming lieutenant governor has definitely been watched closely. Statewide races in Virginia are tough.
He compared her situation to Glenn Youngkin's narrow win.
Oh, so.
He suggested Democrats tend to lose by, quote, overreaching, while Republicans, maybe except for Trump, often lose through inaction.
Ah, that framing. Voter backlash against perceived extremism versus voter frustration with lack of progress.
Yeah, it's a common way to look at election dynamics. Can perceived extremism on one side or perceived lack of delivery on the other swing things.
Both can definitely be factors in outcomes.
He also pointed out the simple fact that Democrats have a registration advantage in Virginia.
True. An uphill climb for Republicans statewide.
Which leads into a personal story he shared from his own run for the House of Delegates in Newport News.
Okay. What was the takeaway?
It's a district with a significant African-American population, about 50-50 overall, and he spoke very frankly about the difficulties Republicans face there.
Why? Historical patterns.
Yeah, historical voting patterns, plus what he called wokeness. Just a candid look at the challenges of crossing those lines in Virginia politics.
Understanding the demographic shifts, the history of voting patterns, evolving social attitudes. Essential for anyone running in Virginia now.
And one more point on Virginia, the influence of the military-industrial complex.
Back to that theme. How does it play out specifically in Virginia?
He argued it's huge in Virginia, obviously, given the economy, and he described it as inherently woke, making it really hard to challenge the status quo there.
Because defense spending is so vital economically, it creates a powerful interest group resistant to change.
That seems to be his argument. Challenging military spending or foreign policy could have big economic ripples statewide, influencing politicians and the whole discourse.
Yeah, Virginia's economy is heavily tied to defense. Creates a complex dynamic, for sure.
Okay, moving on. Election integrity in Virginia. He raised some concerns.
Like what?
Described the voting rules as loose. Mentioned same-day registration, provisional ballot specifically.
Common points of debate in election administration discussions.
Yeah.
Balancing security and access.
Right. And he shared an anecdote from his own House race again, suggesting the outcome was affected by early voting trends he felt Youngkin had cultivated.
Highlighting the ongoing debate about how secure and accessible our elections are, or should be.
He also brought in some international context, mentioned France bans absentee ballots.
Interesting.
And the Carter-Baker Commission recommendations here in the U.S., that bipartisan effort to improve election administration.
Right. Showing there are different models, different ways to approach it. Carter-Baker aimed to strengthen both integrity and efficiency.
Looking at other countries can offer useful perspectives, yeah? Potential pros and cons of different systems.
Definitely.
Then, another personal story. He talked about unsolicited absentee ballot applications being sent to younger voters in his own house.
Ah, raising questions about third-party voter outreach groups.
Yeah, exactly. Those kinds of anecdotes sometimes fuel concerns about, potential manipulation or influence in the process.
Voter registration drives, GOTV efforts by outside groups, they definitely play a role. Understanding the rules and ethics around them is important for public trust.
Okay, let's pivot now to his ideas for sort of revitalizing Virginia and maybe the Republican Party more broadly.
All right. What were his proposals?
One big one, repeal personal property taxes.
Wow, okay. That would be significant. Why?
To encourage investment and ownership in the state, he actually drew a parallel to Bukele in El Salvador.
Interesting comparison. How so?
Focusing on crime reduction and strengthening property rights as ways to drive positive change. It's a bold idea for Virginia, given how much localities rely on property taxes.
Huge revenue source for schools, infrastructure. Repealing it would mean finding other funding, massive impact on homeowners, renters. And the El Salvador comparison, while interesting, involves very different contexts. Right?
Absolutely. Very different places. But the core idea is about boosting investment through tax policy and property rights.
Got it. What else?
Education. He proposed a pretty radical shift there, too. School. Essentially, yeah. Giving parents the per-pupil funding amount to use for homeschooling, private school, or public school.
Right. The argument that it empowers parents, especially those maybe feeling stuck in underperforming school districts.
He specifically framed it partly as a way to help African-American communities in that situation.
It's a long-running debate. School choice. Strong arguments on both sides about competition, outcomes, funding for public schools, equity.
Very passionate debate, for sure. Now, turning to the really complex and often sensitive topic of identity politics and race.
Okay.
Corey, who was part of the original discussion source, shared his perspective as a Black man. He questioned the constant focus on racism by groups like the NAACP.
Challenging the dominant narrative from within the community.
Yeah, recounting personal experiences where he pushed back against those narratives. It's a critical, sometimes uncomfortable, but really necessary conversation, isn't it?
Absolutely. These discussions are deeply personal, lots of different viewpoints, need sensitivity and willingness to listen.
Matt then shared his own story, campaigning in an African-American church, intentionally quoting Malcolm X.
To spark a reaction, start a dialogue.
Seems like it. And both he and Corey apparently agreed that, quote, identity politics is nonsense.
That's a strong stance. Challenging the idea that group identity should be the main lens for politics and social issues, it's complex, isn't it? Some see identity politics as vital for marginalized groups to fight for rights and address inequality.
Right, while others argue it fuels division, maybe overlooks shared values or common goals.
Yeah, focuses too much on group differences, perhaps.
Matt also brought up Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1960s report on the African-American family.
Ah, the Moynihan Report. Still controversial, still discussed, highlighting societal trends identified decades ago.
Yeah. They also talked about RFK Jr.'s apparent appeal across diverse groups and strategies for reaching Black voters beyond typical Democratic messages.
Focusing on things like economic opportunity, school choice maybe.
That seemed to be the emphasis, exploring different approaches to address challenges faced by the community.
Moynihan's report certainly sparked debate about social and economic factors, and reaching voters on shared concerns like economy, education. It's a common political outreach strategy, trying to move beyond just identity appeals.
They really stressed the importance of honest conversation, extending the olive branch.
Building bridges.
Yeah, echoing Jack Kemp's philosophy. They don't care what you know until they know that you care.
Ah, Kemp. That principle holds true far beyond politics, doesn't it? Empathy, genuine engagement builds trust.
Absolutely. People are more receptive if they think you actually understand and care about their concerns.
Makes sense.
They also noted an interesting trend. More African-American women becoming gun owners.
Yeah, that's a data point that challenges some assumptions, doesn't it?
It does. And then there was this compelling anecdote from a barbershop conversation.
Oh, yeah. About what?
Highlighting concerns about gender ideology in schools. Just showing some of the cultural anxieties present in many communities right now.
Shifts in gun ownership demographics, debates around gender identity in schools. These reflect broader cultural discussions about values, parental rights, education's role.
This led into a wider discussion about what they saw as a major cultural shift, maybe an obsession with sexuality in society.
Referencing things like the pornography revolution.
Yeah, and its impact. Matt even compared things to Viktor Orban's policies in Hungary.
Orban, regarding pornography and family
Right.
values.
Highlighting a contrast in how different societies are approaching these issues, more restrictive approaches versus others.
The easier access to porn, the broader cultural talk around sexuality, it's definitely had a big impact on norms and values. Different societies are grappling with it differently.
Which then led them naturally into global perspectives, demographics, culture.
Okay, like declining birth rates.
Exactly. That phenomenon called the demographic winter in many Western nations.
Big concern for governments. Implications for economies, welfare systems, national identity.
Yeah. They mentioned government responses like Hungary's financial incentives for having kids,
Right, trying to encourage larger families.
but also raised the possibility of more coercive measures maybe coming down the line elsewhere.
It's a serious challenge.
Yeah.
Policy responses vary widely based on cultural values, political priorities.
They contrasted Germany's approach using immigration to offset population decline,
Right. Importing labor.
with Hungary's much stricter policies focused on preserving national culture.
Yeah, highlighting the different strategies nations use, each with pros and cons, especially around social and cultural integration.
Immigration is so complex, balancing economic needs with concerns about cultural cohesion, national identity. Tough question.
Gary.
They also talked about the importance of shared cultural and legal foundations for a nation's success, contrasting the American experiment, which had certain shared foundations, with attempts to just impose constitutions elsewhere without that underlying agreement.
Right. The idea that success often depends on shared values, legal principles, cultural norms. Trying to plant a system without that soil can be hard.
Yeah, history shows that. And the idea that maybe freedoms are best appreciated, best preserved, when they've actually been fought for.
That struggle deepens the value, perhaps, leads to greater appreciation. Compelling thought.
And finally, they really got into the role of religion in society, in politics. Still powerful.
How so? What examples?
Highlighted John Calvin's influence, religious freedom, private banking, representative government.
Okay, Calvinism's impact on Western development.
And Martin Luther, translating the Bible, empowering individuals with direct access to Scripture.
The Reformation's consequences were huge, for law, politics, society.
They also discussed the global rise of Islam, its demographic trends, attributing some of that growth to a strong emphasis on faith and family values.
The connection between religious belief, family structures, and demographics is definitely significant, worth observing.
And the example of the Church of England was interesting.
In what way?
The contrast between the main church and its Nigerian branch on social issues.
Showing the diversity within a single global denomination. How different cultural contexts shape interpretation and practice.
Exactly. Even within one tradition, you see big variations globally. The overarching point being, religion is still a major, inextricable driver of policy, politics, culture worldwide.
It really is. Global interconnectedness highlights both convergence and divergence in religious views on key issues.
So, okay, wrapping up this deep dive, what are the key things for listeners to maybe take away?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We really have. From one person's shifting political journey to the specifics of Virginia politics, then zooming way out to global trends in population, culture, religion.
You heard a firsthand account of how allegiances can change. A pretty candid look at Virginia's landscape.
Yeah, and that wide discussion touching everything from election integrity to those deeper cultural anxieties shaping things.
And I think what really stands out is how interconnected it all is. Personal experiences shape political views, right? Those views influence local and national politics. And none of it happens in a vacuum. It's playing out globally with culture and religion as powerful undercurrents.
So here's maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. Consider that complex interplay, between your own beliefs, maybe political actions you take, and these broader cultural currents we discussed.
How do they shape not just society, but your own understanding of the challenges, the opportunities ahead?
Yeah, and are the old labels, the traditional political approaches we know, are they still really relevant in a world changing this fast?
Good question.
And maybe, what assumptions do you need to set aside? What lights might you need to turn off in your own thinking, as the source put it, to see what's maybe in a different corner?
Yeah, this dive really underscores how important critical thinking is. Being willing to look beyond the usual narratives we get.
The challenges are complex, multifaceted, requires considering lots of perspectives, examining our own assumptions constantly.
Absolutely.
If you want to explore more of these kinds of in-depth perspectives, we definitely encourage checking out the New Right Report Substack.
Should be findable with a quick web search. New Right Substack probably does it.
Yeah, I imagine so. Look, this conversation really just scratched the surface.
Always does, doesn't it?
It does, but we hope it sparks some curiosity for you to maybe dig deeper into these topics, research the people, the events mentioned.
And ultimately form your own informed opinions.
Exactly. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.